smell and the noise and the whinny of the horse.
It would just be this wild melee and all this blinding dust with enemy soldiers looming up in front of you, just as frightened and angry as you are.
His Majesty set out on his Electrum chariot, dressed in his battle gear, strong-armed like Horus the Lord, his father Amun strengthening his arms.
The Egyptians forced the enemy to flee, back within the walls of Megiddo.
The enemy kings are galloping back to the city and having to abandon their wonderful gold and silver chariots because the city has closed its gates. The city is not going to open its gates while the Egyptian army is out there, and these kings have to be hauled up the city walls in knotted garments that the people had let down. It was a complete rout. The enemy crumpled completely before the Egyptian attack.
But on the verge of victory, Thutmosis' plan went wrong.
He wanted his forces to continue immediately to the city and take the city. But the Egyptian troops stopped to plunder the enemy dead and the enemy camp. He can't stop it. The army is going to plunder, and he can't get them to stop it.
They don't do a head count in ancient Egypt. They do a hand count. They cut the hands off. They pile them up in a whole mound, and then they count them, one at a time. Pretty gory business, but I suppose it's not quite as horrid as cutting their heads off.
Each enemy hand was worth its weight in gold. But in their plundering, Thutmosis' army had given the enemy time to gather safely behind the city walls. The Egyptians had no choice but to surround Megiddo and wait.
He did not have to conduct an attack on the city, because by setting up this stockade, he signaled that he intended to starve them out, not attack them and try to take the city by storm.
For the next 7 months, while the princes in Megiddo slowly starved, Thutmosis and his army raided the surrounding countryside. Finally, Megiddo surrendered. Hundreds of years later, when the writer of the Book of Revelation spoke of the last battle of Doomsday, he would set it here in Megiddo. He would call it Armageddon. The Pharaoh returned in triumph to Thebes. Megiddo and all its wealth now belonged to Thutmosis. On the walls of Karnak Temple, his scribes recorded the staggering scale of the booty they had captured.
Living prisoners, 340. Chariots of his wretched army, 892. Cows, 1,929. Male and female slaves and their children, 1,796. Walking sticks with human heads, 3.
The war booty and tribute that poured into Thebes would make it one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. In a stroke of genius, the Pharaoh also brought back the children of the defeated princes to indoctrinate them in the ways of Egypt.
They would grow up in an Egyptian school. They'd learn Egyptian. It was rather like what the British did in India by taking the children of Maharajas and bringing them back to public schools in England. That way, the princes became semi-Egyptian.
But at the same time, of course, they were hostages to their father's good behavior. And as their father aged, they were sent back to replace him, now thoroughly inculcated with Egyptian attitudes.
In Nubia, Thutmosis went one step further. He appointed a viceroy to rule over Nubia. The viceroy was called Overseer of the Gold Countries. He secured Egypt's lifeline, all the gold the pharaoh needed to rule his empire.
Mahmud III established that empire, and he gave this empire the leadership. He gave the empire how the empire became to be strong, how he controlled the south at the Sixth Cataract, and controlled the eastern Syria, Palestine, and this area in Iraq. Then the whole world was under Thebes, under his control.
For all these successes, Thutmose pledged thanks to one god, Amun-Re. The pharaoh's first task on returning from Megiddo was solemn. The king approached the inner sanctuary. Alone, Thutmose made offerings to the god he credited with his victory, the god who granted him an empire. According to Thutmose, the god spoke to him.
I gave you valor and victory over all lands. I set your might, your fear in every country, that you may lead the living forever.
Stepping back, the king cast sand on the floor to obscure his footprints and ensure no one else entered the god's presence. Thutmose could return into the light with the blessing of Amun for his new empire. Only 100 years earlier, Egypt had been on the verge of extinction. But by the end of Thutmose's reign, Egypt controlled Nubia, the Syrian and Lebanese coasts, and parts of Israel and Palestine.
The Egyptians moved into territories that they never thought they probably would reach at all. It is an enormous empire. It's the biggest empire that has ever been conquered, and it is ruled by one king. And the wealth of the world arrives in Egypt, and receiving it is the king of Egypt. He is the richest man in the world at that time. He is the ruler of the greatest empire.
It was the beginning. It was a first attempt to create a unified whole from among nations of different faiths, different traditions, different languages. That concept had not been realized before in history.
The Egyptian empire was born. The question now was, what the pharaoh would do with his empire of gold.